So, good evening, everyone. I'm Sandy Borden, the director of the Ethics Center at Western Michigan University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation about ethics and political rhetoric. This is the Ethics Center's last program of the semester, so be sure to check www.mich.edu/ethics for news of our spring offerings. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the program, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's guest. To do so, just type your question into the chat. The Ethics Center's intern, Anastasia Sikala, will be keeping track of your questions. As time allows, we'll address as many questions as we can during the Q&A at the end of the program. We'll be recording this lecture and sharing the link after the event. Western students, if you're attending this event for signature credit, Anastasia will be putting a link into the chat for you to record your attendance. There will be also resources in the chat about the project on ethics and political communication, and also about the Ethics Center. I'd like to also thank our co-sponsors, the School of Communication at Western and the Department of Political Science at Western. I'm a professor in the School of Communication at Western, where I teach communication ethics, and my research focuses mainly on journalism ethics. My latest book is the Rutledge Companion to Media and Poverty. And luckily, at some point, I became acquainted with Peter Loge, the director of the Project on Ethics and Political Communication at the George Washington University, through our mutual interests. Peter is also the associate director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University and a strategic consultant. He has spent more than 25 years working in politics and strategic communication. His experience includes serving in senior staff positions in the U.S. House and Senate and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration at the end of the Obama administration. His 2018 edited volume, Political Communication Ethics, Theory and Practice, is the first book to bring together perspectives on political communication ethics from leading scholars and leading practitioners. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, Peter, for this conversation. I think we have lots to talk about. But why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about yourself and the Project on Ethics and Political Communication. Oops, I think you may be muted, Peter. I can't hear you, Peter.
There we go.
Yes.
I couldn't unmute myself for a moment there. It was telling me I couldn't do that.
Uh-oh.
Apparently WebEx disagrees with something in my bio. Apparently
There you go.
really angered the bots at WebEx. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you, and thanks everybody for I guess tuning in is the right verb. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to have a conversation about the state of political rhetoric in America today and what we can hopefully do to make it less awful and quite possibly even better.
That's great. So how did the Project on Ethics and Political Communication come about? What do you do?
That's a good question. There's a very long story. I'll save you that and go right to the short one, which is I was an adjunct professor at the George Washington University for a long time, a long time while I was consulting or working on the Hill or whatever. And in the fall of 2017, I joined the faculty full time. And in all of my classes, I would talk about ethics, but it was kind of a thing, right? It was hey, think about this. We're giving you the tools to go forth and shape democracy. And our alumni include one of President Obama's top speechwriters, the only speechwriter Marco Rubio ever had, Facebook's first hire in DC, the head of one of the top digital people on the Biden campaign, the press secretary for the Republican Governors Association. So I tried to drive home the point that, like, look, you GW students have a unique responsibility. When I joined the faculty full time, somebody suggested, look, we teach journalism ethics. It's a huge deal, Professor Borden, as you know. There are textbooks and journals and conferences and a whole infrastructure. Political communication is increasingly being taught around the country. Something like 20 schools offered as a major. There's a number of programs, a lot of schools offered as a minor. There are lots of courses on political communication, a lot of graduate programs or certificates in political communication, but there is no equivalent infrastructure, right? If you major in public relations, journalism, law, business, medicine, any of these fields, public policy, you have to take courses in ethics. That simply isn't the case in political communication. And one of my colleagues, Steve Roberts, noted journalist who has a new book out about his late wife Koki, which I really highly recommend. He said, "Look, we should do the same on the political communication side. So why don't you do that, Peter?" I was like, "Great, of course, I'd love to. This sounds like a terrific idea." And so I did what anybody would do, anybody on this conversation would do when faced with teaching a new class. I went to Google and I typed in political communication ethics syllabus. because I thought somebody's done this, right? And nothing came up, which was problematic for a lot of reasons. So well, then Amazon, right? That's the next best thing to Google on type political communication ethics. Only a couple of books came up. The most recent was published, I think, in 2000, and it was entirely the terrific book edited by a guy named Bob Denton, Rupert Denton, who's retiring from Virginia Tech. But it was all academics, and it was all, frankly, is dated. The chapter on television advertising just didn't make any sense in 2017. So, well, this is a problem. Like, I'm going to teach this course. I need content, but also we need to sort of generate content in general. We need to have this conversation with students. We need to have this conversation with faculty. And so I started to do that, to generate content. We have a 5-question series where we ask political practitioners, professionals, press, numbers of people, the same 5 questions about ethics and political communication that you graciously recently responded to. Some really terrific, insightful answers. We have some responses from Jennifer Rubin, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, for a recent alum who's in graduate school, while also a digital strategist working on a campaign, from a venture capitalist, from a range of folks. We host conversations with students, with practitioners, and with academics, including the day before yesterday, as you know, on the effects of elite political rhetoric on support for democratic norms, with a guy named Ethan Porter, who's a colleague of mine, with Karen Finney, who's a noted Democratic strategist and political analyst on CNN, and a student who's graduating into this hot mess we call American politics. And we have a number, I give talks, like we have conversations like this around the country, and much to my pleasant surprise, political professionals are calling. So a consulting firm called out of the blue right after we started and said, hey, can you come talk to our firm? A lobbying firm in Maryland called and said, hey, we wanted you to talk to our lobbyists, but also to a lot of our clients. A big international organization that does work all over the world on human rights, civil society, things like that, called me and a friend of mine and said, hey, can you come talk about the ethics of our advocacy, which has been really heartening. I'd frankly given up on me and my cohort. We know what we're doing, just ask us. We're right all along. So I figured we'll just sort of abandon those of us who are like me and only work in the next generation of activists. But it turns out that a lot of people like me have the same questions I do, which is, how do we do this better? So that's believe it or not, that's a short version of the long story.
Thanks for sharing it. So how do you define ethical political communication yourself?
That is
What does that mean?
an excellent question. The question on the table for the project is, what ethical responsibility, if any, do political communication professionals have, and do they have it? And I ask the question not because I have the answer hidden behind me somewhere. It's because I don't know. Not only do I not define political ethics, I also don't define political communication. On one hand, what is political communication? Is it just the advertising? Is it just email? Is it just the speeches, or does it include lobbying? Most of us who work in politics, most of the time, don't work on candidate campaigns. There aren't that many of them. They're cyclical, and if your guy loses, as often as not, he or she doesn't pay the bills. So a lot of political communication is the NRA or Pro-Choice America or World Wildlife Fund or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or things like that. So does that count as political communication? And I think the answer is yes. So that's one question. The ethical question is trickier, and I don't have the answer. My standing joke is that if I taught at Georgetown or Boston College or another school like that, we would debate all semester, and in the end, the Jesuits would win. But I don't, and the Jesuits might be wrong. So what I encourage my students and practitioners to do is to figure out for themselves, what does that mean? And to really spend some time thinking, what is in bounds and out of bounds? What are my foundations? Why am I in this? And then write it down and to stick with that. And for me personally, my foundation is don't do anything that undermines the premise or practice of a liberal democracy, and to the extent you can, always promote it. I'm a partisan. I've run campaigns. I've run some pretty hard-hitting campaigns, and I've been the victim of some pretty vicious hits. But as long as they're fair, that's cool. Right? I'm a soccer guy, right? I'm mostly a defender. I will knock you down if you're in my way, right? I'll try at least, but I'm not going to go for your Achilles because that would end your career. That's kind of how I view politics. If it's a fair hit, it's a clean hit, I hit you. But I'm not going to do anything that would undermine or dishonor, frankly, the game or our shared enterprise. And that's kind of my standard for politics as well.
So I love the soccer analogy as a soccer fan. Maybe we're gonna have
Yes.
to do another one of these on soccer ethics.
My other book
Uh,
is actually on soccer. My other book is
I
on
know
soccer.
this. I've actually looked at it. So we just had elections all over the country on Tuesday, so everybody's talking about that. So was there any political rhetoric during those campaigns that you followed that raised some red flags for you based on your conception of ethical political communication?
A good question. I think there's some very good news and some random bad news coming out of the 2021 elections. Of course, statewide elections in New Jersey and Virginia. Those are the big states that are doing it, but there are also mayor's races in Boston and New York and Minneapolis, ballot initiatives in Minneapolis, mayor's race in Buffalo, other places around the country. I think the bad ethical news is sort of the usual ethical nonsense. Terry McAuliffe, the losing gubernatorial candidate in Virginia, saying that Youngkin, the Republican, held a rally with Donald Trump right before the election. He did not. Trump held a virtual rally on his own that Youngkin distanced himself from. I mean, Youngkin was in this interesting position of having to get Trump voters without being like Trump. And it was politically, it's a fine line, and as a political professional, I think he did a pretty good job of that. McAuliffe's line was a lie, but I'm not sure that anybody cares or matters. Like that's kind of the okay, whatever. I think the really bad stuff to which people paid a lot of attention, rightly, was email fundraising. A guy named Shane Goldmacher at the New York Times has written a series of stories on this. There's a publication in an industry group called Campaigns and Elections that has written a fair amount of this and driven attention to it. We've talked about it at the project. And those are the emails that we all get. If you make the mistake of opening one email once from any candidate ever, anywhere, you're suddenly on everybody's list everywhere. It's the 500% match. It's the automatic recurring donations got a lot of attention. So the Trump campaign raise money by asking for $100 or $50 or $1,000, whatever. But you would automatically be a recurring donation. So you give your credit card number once, and every month money would be charged to your credit card. It was hard to get out of that. And the Trump campaign ended up having to return more than $60 million. And states and the federal government are now looking at banning automatic recurring donations. Like if you want to donate every month to the Republican National Committee or Democratic National Committee, great. But you ought to consciously say, yes, I want to do this rather than opting out.
Right.
The 500% match is not true. No one is sitting there saying, I'm waiting for Loge to donate $1 so I can kick in $500. That's simply untrue. Speaker Pelosi got in a lot of trouble because there's one email that said she personally would write a check to match. She did not personally write a check to match. That simply didn't happen. There are the hair on fire emails. I'm on the list for a Democratic candidate for Senate in Florida named Alan Grayson. Right after Texas passed a pretty restrictive abortion law, he sent out an email saying Texas outlawed 40 million women, which is untrue. It's a restrictive law. I
Mhm.
disagree with the law, right? I've worked in Democratic politics, but it's not illegal to be a woman in the state of Texas. That's simply not true. Other tactics that Democrats got in trouble for early on were things that look like job interview postings. Sign
Mhm.
up. Did you miss your interview? Do you want a job with the Biden administration? People would open it. Or it would be notices, Social Security notices or final bill notices, things like that. That remains a problem, mostly on the Republican side, frankly. The big Democratic, there are a handful of platforms. If you get to the Democrats, odds are good you're giving through something called Act Blue. They've changed their rules because they recognize what's going on. The equivalent firm on the Republican side has not yet. There's a big Democratic fundraising firm that writes these emails um, called Mothership Strategies, and they continue to just be awful actors in this space. Other Democratic firms are making a point of saying that we behave above board and we also make more money.
Mhm.
There's a firm out of Chicago called spacing on the name of it now, but it's run by a guy named Mike Nellis, and their candidates included Vice President Harris, um, a bunch of races in Colorado, and they say, look, we're raising more money than anybody else, and we're doing it in ways that are actually optimistic, that don't try to trick people, that are no gimmicks. So that remains a problem. I think, but I also said there was good news, and my good news is nobody who has lost or appears to be losing, because they haven't called New Jersey yet, has said fraud. Right? McAuliffe said,
Mhm.
I lost.
Mhm.
And his statement said, please join me and my wife in wishing the governor-elect the best. We are here
Mhm.
to help, which is how it's supposed to happen. In New
Mhm.
Jersey, it looks like the Republican lost. Everybody's called it. The Republican's not conceding. I get it. I've been on the other end of those. You don't want to concede until every vote's counted. But he's not saying, he's not raising questions about voting machines or about, Bill Gates implanting people with COVID microchips and somehow Bolivians. Like, there's none of that nonsense, which is really heartening because the Trump campaign and a lot of his enablers continue to spread the big lie, which simply undermines faith in democracy. So I was really pleased to see that the people who are losing or appear to be losing are behaving as you're supposed to behave. If it's over, say congratulations, I'm here to help.
Mhm.
If it's too close to call, say, you know what, we're going to wait and see. But in the meantime, let's just wait and see.
So you brought up the big lie. It's the false narrative, right, about the 2020 election being stolen. And actually, you brought this to my attention. A new survey by the Nonpartisan Public Religion Research Institute showing 3 in 10 Americans believe this conspiracy theory, and 1 in 6 believe violence may be warranted to quote unquote save our country. That is a scary statistic to me. So what do you think we can learn about this? I mean, what are the implications for democracy? You said that's kind of your guiding
Yeah.
principle, right? To always act on behalf of, liberal democratic principles.
Yeah, and to be clear, liberal democratic is little l, little d. This is sort of Enlightenment
Right.
Rousseau visions. This isn't, I've got a Jimmy Carter bumper sticker somewhere vision. The the survey was really interesting. It's a really long and in-depth set of research that looks at a number of issues. That the stuff that got the headlines was um, people's belief and faith in democracy and what happened. A number of those who said violence might be necessary were actually also liberals. It wasn't just conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the telling and frightening numbers were that 82% of those whose primary news source is Fox News believe the election was stolen. 2020 election is stolen. 97% of those who rely on news outlets to the right of Fox News believe the election was stolen. The election was not stolen, right? There was fraud. Of course there was fraud. Of course people cheated and double voted. That happens every election. It happened probably less in 2020 than it did in 2016 and in 2012 and on back. And even in elections where where questions were raised. In 2004, a number of Democrats were angry at the voting machines in Ohio, for example, and then Senator Boxer wanted to delay the electoral count in Ohio. I don't know anybody who took that seriously. It passed in 2004. Kerry conceded, said, I lost. I wish the administration the best of luck. In 2000, really contentious race. It came down to 100 and some odd votes in Florida and how you count people who punched holes in ballots. After a long and contentious debate, then Vice President Gore said, I concede. I wish the Bush administration the best of luck. In 1960, I could make a really good case that Kennedy stole the election from Richard Nixon with a lot of voter fraud in places like Illinois. Um, Nixon conceded, right? This is outlined by a guy named Ed Brookover, who's a big deal Republican consultant who wrote a chapter in the book that you mentioned. That did not happen in 2020. There was not enough widespread fraud or cheating or malfeasance to have changed the results of the election. Joe Biden was elected fairly and legitimately the president of the United States. Anything else countering that is simply untrue. And it's bad for democracy to keep saying that. Ethan Porter, my colleague who I mentioned earlier, he and a bunch of his colleagues did an experiment early in the fall, asking people how they felt about Trump's claims that the election was stolen, the election was rigged, and what does it do for their faith in democracy? Right? We know that what politicians say about roads or bridges or climate affects how people feel about roads and bridges and climate and taxes and all sorts of things. Their question was, can it affect how they feel about democracy? And the answer is yes. It turns out a lot of people who support Donald Trump believe the election was stolen because they're reading his tweets that say the election was stolen. And they have less confidence in our democratic processes. The flip side of that is it increases confidence on the other side. Democrats go, aha, it's stronger. I'd be interested to see if that was also the case in 2018 when Stacey Abrams, a Democrat who lost the governor's race in Georgia, said it was a stolen election. I'd be interested to know if Republican confidence in elections increased and if Democrats decreased. I worry that it's a bit of a downward spiral, that Stacey Abrams opened the door for Donald Trump. Donald Trump ran through the door. He's great at running through open doors. That's really, for me, very, very troubling. And I think that the answer to all of it is we just have to do better, which is a weak answer, but I think that we're not going to pass a law that says you have to speak a certain way in politics. right? Not only would the First Amendment get in the way, but that's kind of not the point of democracy. We're not going to pass a law that says what you can and can't say to your neighbor is what you can and can't claim. Like if you want to believe that John F. Kennedy Jr. is coming back from the dead and is going to reunite with Trump in Dallas to resume his rightful place as whatever, as apparently a handful of people did, good for you. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us who do politics for a living, who are privileged to be able to work in democracy, to stand up to not behave badly, right? I mean, I can cheat, but I don't cheat because that would be wrong, right? And democracy relies on people participating at some level honestly. And so I think we have to be we just have to behave better. We have to create a norm of behaving better. We have to set it as an expectation. We have to teach our students. We're teaching them how to write tweets and engage in social media, to write press releases, to set up events. We need to teach them ethics. We can't just say, oh, by the way, be good. We have to have them wrestle with their ethical questions. Um, Consulting firms have to make ethics part of their training and part of their, we're going to hear your HR benefits. We're going to have a lunch and learn about retirement funds. We're going to have a lunch and learn about ethics. Reporters like Shane Goldmacher at the New York Times, Business Insider has done a really good job of this, have to make ethical violations front and center. During the 2020 election, I got called by the press a fair amount. Hey, did this campaign break the law? Did this ad break the law? My answer is I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a political guy. But I'm happy to answer the question of whether or not one ought to have done that. And so that just become part of the reporting, right? It just becomes the norm, which is what we're hoping to do with the project, which I know is what you're hoping to do. Events like this matter a lot, I think. Again, another very long answer to a very short question. I'll stop filibustering now. I'm sorry. We're
I'm
going to ban the
glad I
filibuster.
So obviously, I agree with you. I think this is precisely why we do these kind of events, right? Is to have these conversations. I think it's incredibly important that we have spaces where we can reflect on ethics. And often professions, businesses don't make those kinds of spaces available. And I think people are really aching to talk about these things and gain some clarity and some perspective. So again, thanks for tonight. So you mentioned the fact that people who watch Fox News and some other, maybe media farther to the right have these distorted opinions about what happened in 2020. But a lot of people have focused on the role of Facebook and other social media in distorting the conversation around politics. Things have sure changed a whole lot. Thanks to social media and, filter bubbles and fake news and whatnot. I mean, a lot of people who have these convictions have them because they believe things that are not true. And they believe those things largely because they're consuming information in ways that were not even possible, 15 years ago, even 20 years ago.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. You're a journalist. You've been a working journalist as well as an academic, so you know well that fake news isn't new, right? Wood
mm-hmm,
Randall famously said, "You provide the pictures, I'll provide the war."
mm-hmm,
Um, the in the campaign of 1780 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, Adams' supporters, including the then president of Yale University, Reverend Timothy Dwight, said that if Jefferson were elected president, our wives and daughters would be subject to legal prostitution. There were Adams planted fake news stories about Jefferson in the press. Jefferson did not stoop to respond. He hired someone to stoop to respond on his behalf. I mean, among other things, George Orwell was a collector of pamphlets, the broadsides, and
mm-hmm,
pamphlets were kind of the Twitter and social media of the day. And Orwell's description, which I it's up there somewhere behind me, said something like all this required is they could be in prose or in song or serious or diatribes. They just have to be polemical and short. So this has always been with us, and American politics has always been a hot stinking mess. What, as you say, is different though is social media is faster and bigger, right? It just moves incredibly fast. When I volunteered in my first campaign as a kid, my job, because I was a kid, I had a bicycle and I could hand deliver press releases to media outlets. I'd ride around my hometown handing out press releases. Many, many years later, I put the first member of Congress on the internet. That was a long time ago.
mm-hmm.
Things have changed. So I think that how we provide and consume information online is kind of an open question. Clearly, the platforms have to do better. The question is, what does better look like? Is it federal regulation? Is it internal standards? And I don't know the answer to that. One of the challenges of Congress regulating it is, in addition to First Amendment issues, is they frankly don't understand the issue. There aren't enough tech specialists, right? There,
Mhm.
it's just too new to think about. I think it's some of my colleagues again at GW run something called the Institute for Data Democracy and Politics, and they're trying to unpack this question now. A huge problem online is online intimidation. Again, you know this from your journalism background, but journalists are getting targeted online, especially women journalists and journalists in foreign countries. I mean, whenever I'm in the press, I get nasty notes, and somebody found me on Facebook and said that Trump is coming for people like me and all of that, and that's tame. So I think what we can do as advocates is, one, don't say stuff that unless we triple check its accuracy. Two, raise the level of the dialogue. Right? Twitter's great at the snappy, aha, I got you. No, tell that to your dog, type it, then delete it. Raise the bar, create a norm among your friends, among your colleagues, that to simply behave better online. If you see somebody behaving badly online, call them out. One of your friends is spreading nonsense about the vaccine or about the 2020 election, say, hey, look, this is just not true. Here are the facts. In fact, we know fact checking works. The backlash effect largely isn't true. Fact checking largely works. I think we have to create a social norm. We expect better behavior because we'll act better, right? And it's not going to solve everything, right? I live in downtown DC, and there's sometimes litter in front of my house. I live a couple blocks from bars and restaurants. People leave pizza boxes in front of my house. I pick up the pizza box and I throw it away. It's not going to solve litter in DC. It's not going to solve climate. It's not going to stop the rats. But I don't want litter in front of my house. If I pick up litter in front of my house, my neighbor's more likely to pick up litter in front of his house because he doesn't want to be the house with all litter in front of it. I think we can all do the same online.
So it's interesting. I've looked into this too because I think the regulation question is really challenging for the reasons that you mentioned. I also think that we don't have structures in place to really deal with the complexity of the problem. Like, there's all these different moving parts, and we don't have the kind of systems in place to deal with them. And then there's the whole question of the algorithms and how opaque they are. It's a really challenging environment. And I know that my students get most of their news, all right, from their social media feeds, and they often are not able to tell, what kind of information they're consuming, right? I know one of my colleagues, Sue Ellen Christian, registered for this event. I hope she's here. She does a lot of work on media literacy, but it just seems to me as a really complicated problem that exceeds perhaps individual efforts to
Yeah,
do better. Um, Not that
it's
I
a
have a
yeah,
solution either.
right. But I think it's a yes and right. I mean, if we're waiting for
Hmm.
Mark Zuckerberg to wake up tomorrow morning and say, aha, I'm now going to change the world again, like we're going to be waiting for a very long time. I think that we have to do better. Social media outfits have to do better. There needs to be better regulation. Further complicating it all, of course, is where is the information? Not just where is it coming from,
Right.
right? Are they being generated by bad actors in Russia or China or elsewhere, or Iran, as we found they happened in the past? But literally, where are the servers? Can
Hmm.
you regulate speech that's outside of your jurisdiction? And when we first were looking at, remember, we were first trying to regulate the internet and how Congress was going to respond to this new technology in the mid 90s, especially around things like pornography and child pornography, is where are the servers? And can
Hmm.
you regulate something on the consumer's end? Right, we see this now with the 230 debate, Section 230 debates. Can you hold the phone company liable for a conversation you and I have about illegal activity? Well, of course not. The phone company's in charge. Can't control what we say. Okay, so can you hold AOL liable for the content of emails you and I send each other, which was a thing in the 90s? I don't know. Can you hold Facebook liable for something I post on Facebook? What if I'm not in the US?
Hmm.
What if Facebook's servers are not in the US? How does that get regulated? And again, I haven't the slightest idea. It is absurdly complicated. What I
Absolutely.
can do, though, is say that as a political consumer, I try to be smarter. It's not just read a wide variety of sources. Like, of course, you do that. And of course, we all don't as much as we know that we should, like flossing, right? But it's also as political activists, as political actors, um, do promote things that you would be willing to explain to your parents or your friends. right? That if somebody did it to you, you say, wow, that was a hard hit, but that was a clean hit. Or that if your mom called you and said, what is this garbage? You had a good straight-faced answer, right? Because it's up to us who produce this stuff. Like I've got clients and I'm advising them on comms, right? So it's up to me to say, hey, there's another way to phrase this, right? You heard Karen Finney say this
Mhm,
the other
mhm,
day
mhm,
in our conversation. Mike Nellis, who runs this firm out of Chicago, does that. There are some Republicans I know who do the same thing. Say, look, you please. Youngkin had a terrific ad against Terry McAuliffe, I thought, where when McAuliffe was governor in Virginia, you can't be governor twice in a row.
mhm,
So but you can be governor as often as you want as long as you take a break in between. I guess when he was governor when he was elected in 2013, he made a deal with some Chinese company to bring a factory to Virginia and promised a bunch of jobs as a ribbon cutting, and there were tax breaks, all of these sorts of things. Jobs never emerged. Deal fell through. Youngkin hit him on that. That's a good clean hit.
mhm,
Totally fair. Um, Taking Terry McAuliffe's words out of context about education, probably not. McAuliffe claiming that Youngkin was at a rally with Donald Trump and he was not, that's a lie.
mhm. Good points. So, among the things that there's a lot of misinformation about is COVID, of course, which is still on the minds of voters. I think it was still an issue in these elections on Tuesday. What I've been struck with is the messaging of some government officials regarding public health measures needed to fight COVID. It seems like one of those instances where what politicians say might actually be a matter of life or death. So, yeah, what do you think about that?
Get vaccinated. If you're on this call and you haven't been vaccinated, get vaccinated. Wear a mask. It's not a miracle. Some people get vaccinated and get COVID. Yes, they are much less likely to get sick and die. Wearing a mask is not a panacea. If you wear a mask, it's gonna help. Behave as if your life depended on it and the life of those around you depends on it, because it does. The idea that this was politicized is offensive in the extreme. I also think that if Trump had handled this right, if he had said, this is happening, this is a big deal, this is what we're going to do, and everybody in America was mailed a mask with a flag on it, not Trump could sign it if he wanted to, like he did stimulus checks, like whatever. But I think he would have been reelected because a lot of his voters who were with him on things like crime walked away from him on COVID because it's so clearly wrong. Right. But unfortunately now it's become this litmus test. Like I'm going to own the libs by getting sick, which is just stupid. Right. One study out of the University of Chicago found that people were some academics at the University of Chicago were interested in how do political pundits impact what people are doing. Right. Does what people say on television matter? Uh, Hannity took the COVID pandemic, or one of the news hosts, one of the talk show hosts on Fox, took the pandemic relatively seriously. Tucker Carlson did not. Viewers, they found that regular viewers of Hannity's program got sick and died at lower rates than the viewers of Tucker Carlson's program. What Hannity said saved lives. What Tucker Carlson said killed people because they took his advice. They didn't take it seriously. Right? Don't take horse medicine. This is it you know, that's not even this. It's also good politics, by the way. Like, be seen as helping people, be seen as helping children, be seen as helping the economy. Don't grandstand on issues of public health. What you can do as a partisan is say, who should pay for it? Did we cut too big a sweetheart deal with the pharmaceutical companies? How much of the vaccine should we be sending overseas? What should the school policies be? How is the FDA responding? I mean, there's a lot of partisan room to play here, right? It's not like everybody has to suddenly hold hands and sing kumbaya. What everybody has to say is everybody in America, like you got your measles shot, um, you get these other vaccinations, get your COVID shot so we can have a healthy, literally healthy conversation about what we should do next as a country. And it is so appalling to me that people for political gain would play with people's lives when the data are so clear.
So, another thing that I've seen in the coverage of the elections that is some kind of referendum on Biden's administration, right? So there's lots of things we could talk about there, but in particular, one of the issues I think that President Biden got a lot of flack about was the Afghanistan withdrawal and the rhetoric around that, right? That didn't kind of check out with information on the ground. So, one term that's used sometimes to describe this kind of a mismatch, perhaps, between the facts and reality is political spin. And I guess I'm wondering what your reaction is. I mean, was that political spin? Was it something more serious ethically? What was
Very,
your assessment of that?
very good question. I will come to it. I do want to say though, I think that the COVID vaccine, people not wanting to take the vaccine, and people distrusting the elections are connected. You've had one political party in particular undermining confidence in the U.S. government for decades. Government's the problem, not the solution. Don't trust those scientists, those people in Washington. Democrats run against Washington. They run against bureaucrats. The problem is we rely on those bureaucrats, we rely on those scientists to do things like run free and fair elections, to make sure that the medicine we get is safe and effective, to make sure the food we eat isn't going to kill us. And I think undermining confidence in institutions and governmental institutions is dangerous, right? Always question them. Of course, we should have election observers. Like there've always been election observers. I've sat and watched people count ballots. It's something you do. Of course, you should push the FDA to do better. Part of what I did when I was at the FDA is the commissioner and I flew around the country, meeting with medical schools and business leaders and researchers, saying how can we be better, right? Your job as researchers and companies and entrepreneurs is to push the FDA, maybe to be a little bolder, to be more creative. And our job is to just, hey, say slow down so we don't run into another Theranos. And it's in that tension, I think, that's necessary. So please check. Don't take what the government says at face value, but don't undermine confidence in the basic institutions like public health. The idea that public health officials are getting death threats to me is appalling. That means no one's going to be a public health official.
Mhm.
No one's going to happen, right? It's just flat dangerous. So I think they're connected, and I think that's very dangerous. The Afghanistan question is an interesting one, and it's heartbreaking. I spent a couple of years at the United States Institute of Peace, which is a federally funded independent agency, and we worked in Afghanistan. And we didn't have to follow State Department rules, but we were um, part of the. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat, which is always a mistake. Uh, we were we weren't part of the state. We didn't have to follow State Department rules. We were part of the U.S. government, and so they're holding elections in Afghanistan. A major hotel in which a lot of foreign NGOs and leaders stayed was attacked by the Taliban. And so the U.S. was evacuating people, and U.S. Institute of Peace was flying people in. So we were on the ground, and some really, when I say we, I don't mean me. I mean smarter and braver colleagues than I were there. And so it's really completely heartbreaking. I don't think the American people were paying a huge amount of attention, which is kind of unfortunate. We probably should pay more attention to the world. I think that if I were advising Republicans, I would say Biden's the chaos president, and I would show just violence around the world. I'd show violence in Afghanistan. He blew it in Afghanistan. I'd show violence in any crime scene in the U.S. There's violence in the U.S. I'd show the border, pictures of the border, and say there's chaos at the border, and it sort of feeds this. The dude's out of control. He's out of touch. I think that I don't know enough about the details of what was going on the ground. I mean, clearly the administration did not listen to some of their experts on the ground saying this is going to go sideways really fast and worse than you imagine. The State Department, the leaked cables. We actually, the person who
Mhm.
broke the story of the cables from the Wall Street Journal is a fellow in the School of Media and Public Affairs at GW, and she's talked about this a lot. That there were State Department officials who said, like, we just have to raise alarm bells. I think on foreign policy, in this case, overly optimistic, overly spinning, more aggressively spinning than maybe was necessary. Um, I I want to get to the point in the chat, which I briefly got to, because by also talking about spin. Um, so spin gets a bad name. George Orwell, in his essay "Politics in the English Language," said in 1946, political speech is largely anybody who pays attention knows that it's like political. I'm missing the words exactly, but it's in defense. It's in the defense of the indefensible, meant to give the appearance of solidity to pure wind. Anybody who's paid any attention knows that political writing is bad writing, and he railed against what we now call spin. And we should let the word, let the meaning choose the word. Very, very aggressive on this. Stanley Fish, who's a literary scholar and critic, wrote a piece for the New York Times. It's going to be 15 years ago now. Um, in which he just took Orwell to task, saying, frankly, that's a bad essay. And Fish's argument is to think is to spin. To spin is to have an interested point of view, right? Was Tuesday good news or bad news for Democrats and Republicans, or was it none of the above? The answer is yes. It was good news for moderate Democrats in that a Democrat was, moderate Democrats elected governor or elected mayor of New York. A liberal Democrat was elected mayor of Boston. A Democrat was elected mayor of Buffalo, beating a socialist. This is all good news for Democrats. It was terrible news for Democrats because of suburban women, moms, swung from Biden to the Republicans. It was unsurprising completely because the president's party has not received a majority of the vote in the governor's race in Virginia for at least 40 years. So, yeah, it can't not be those things, right? And so it's, was Biden spinning it? Yeah. Was he spinning it? And the interesting question is, when does spinning become lies? And I don't know. I think that's up to each person. And I would have to look more deeply into what was the president's views. Frankly, I was kind of avoiding the Afghanistan news because it made me really sad. And I had enough other stuff going on. I knew people there. I've got a very close friend who now works in the schools in Baltimore, who um, was in Kabul when the Taliban took Kabul and was in New York on 9/11. And so just too heartbreaking. I do think though that we have to be careful when we get to spinning becoming lies, right? And whether or not um, President Biden isn't clueless. Vice President Harris isn't clueless. These are smart people. They're surrounded by some very smart people. I don't know the president or the vice president. I know people close to them. They are some of them are they're all everybody I know is smart. Some of them are lights out smart. So they're not clueless, and they're obviously politically savvy. The man was elected president of the United States, right? Vice President Harris was elected to the U.S. Senate. She was elected statewide in California. Um, they're obviously not idiots. Part of it is probably strategic optimism. Part of it probably is maybe public shaming. Part of it is a recognition that, look, at the end of the day, something's going to happen. So we're going to have to get to yes. Part of it is if you say we're going to win enough, obviously Democrats will come together to win enough. At the last moment, if Senator Manchin or Senator Sinema is the holdout, you can say, look, everybody thinks the Democrats are going to do this. Are you going to be the one who's going to tank the Democratic agenda? Are you going to be the one? Everybody else promised to be at the party. How come you're not going to be at the party? Right. So part of that is actually probably political strategy. And part of it is they're going to get something. Right. I worked on the Affordable Care Act, and one of our jokes was, is it going to pass? What's going to be in it? What's going to be out of it? That was a terrible. All the videos of the people yelling at members of Congress to kill the bill, kill the bill. My boss was one of the first people to get yelled at, and he insisted on walking through the angry mob to cast the vote, and he insisted I go with him. Mercifully, nobody had any idea who he was because we were just like two guys in suits. Neither one of us is recognizable. So, but one of the jokes was that, even if the bills ultimately everybody in America gets a Band-Aid, we're going to declare victory in healthcare and move on. Something's going to happen. And I think the results in the elections yesterday really drive home that importance, right? I think Virginia might have gone differently had McAuliffe frankly done better with schools, right? I mean, had Democrats delivered on some of these promises, if roads were being built, if we weren't caught in process debates, if there weren't so many obvious things for Republicans to attack. So I think we're going to get something. One thing I do think is a mistake. This is a tactical question, not an ethical question. Is stop setting deadlines. Right? We're going to vote by Friday night, which means if you vote on Monday morning, you failed. Right? We have to have a $3.5 trillion bill. It's only 1.7. Clearly, you caved. Come on, so stop defining the terms of your own failure. Right? I think that's not what you're asking, but I do think that strategically, I mean, that's a tactical thing, and as a tactician,
Yeah.
I can't not weigh in, but. The
So,
question of where
so
spin ends and lying begins is a tricky one.
it's a tricky one. So Taylor, jumping on what you were just talking
Yeah.
about, kind of the sausage making process. Um, again, as a former journalist and somebody who does journalism ethics, I've been a little dismayed by the coverage of these processes. So yes, of course, there's a sense in which they set themselves up, for their opponents, maybe in politics, to jump on and characterize these things this way. But it seems like the media should be actually telling us about like what's in the bills, like what are the stakes, like who would it help, who would it harm? Is this a long-term solution or just a band-aid? It just seems like it's not been as substantial, perhaps, as it could have been. And I think the reason people care about politics or should care is because presumably it helps us all to live well together.
Yeah.
But the political coverage doesn't reflect that
I think
priority,
you know.
I think.
I think you're right. Also, I do, Annette. I appreciate the promotion to doctor. I quit a PhD program because I was a little bit too lazy and didn't have the attention span. So I'm just I'm just some guy at this point. The I think you're right. We've complained about horse race coverage forever, right? Who's ahead and who's behind, and we get really caught up in process coverage. The Biden administration, I think, has tried to get people to pay attention to the details, and the press doesn't want to. I get it. Thanks, Annette. Although
And
you
it's my
might be
colleague.
oh you might be joking about cluelessness. A lot of my friends would not be joking about that. The and certainly not a lot of my students, the 19-year-olds who know better than everybody, just ask them, just like we did when we were 19, right? Uh, I think that the focus on process is as a disservice for a number. Like it's easier to cover and it's more exciting because it's conflict and who's up and who's down and
Mhm.
the palace intrigue. A couple of problems with that. It's also what journalists are drowning in, right? Because they're walking the halls of Congress or they're in these meetings, right? So this is what you're swimming in. The American people really don't care, and moreover, it makes them angry, which is a separate set of problems. But there are a couple of researchers at University of Nebraska, Elizabeth Tice Morse and John Hibbing, who've done a fair amount of research on this, and they wrote a book called Stealth Democracy, late 90s, I want to say. And one of the arguments you hear from a lot of people, good government, civil society people, is the reason people don't like politics is because it's not about them. It's removed. So if you really talk about what people cared about, kitchen table issues, pocketbook issues, whatever other
Mhm.
metaphor issues you want, why then they would engage. So Hibbing and Tice Morse went about trying to sort that out. Is that true? And turns out most people, most of the time, hate politics. They don't want to think about politics. They pay me to think about politics, so they don't have to. Right? I don't think about who's cooking my dinner if I'm going out to eat. I don't think about like I know the guy who does the maintenance on our building in SMPA. I don't want his job. Don't make me think about his job. I don't want to hear him explain the intricacies of his job. We've all been to the doctor, and they'll go into these intricate details using mostly words none of us understand. When all we want to know is so 2 aspirin, call you in a week. Like I would like to feel better. Am I going to feel better? We're good, right? The Hibbing did not write this down, but I have the email somewhere where he confirmed I could say this. That most Americans, most of view politics most of the time like a toilet. They just want it to work. And they found, distressingly, that they view many Americans, not clearly not everybody on this call or in this conversation, but many Americans view political debate as a failure of democracy because we're not solving problems. We're bickering. It's all theater. And the more we talk about process, the less we're just like fixing the damn pothole in front of my house, which is a problem, right? Because democracy is an ongoing debate. We need to teach
Mhm.
people to participate in and respect that debate. So that's a whole separate set of issues. But I think process stories and palace intrigue stories not only do a disservice to whoever's trying to push the policy, and President Trump had a good policy on crime that got frankly buried. President Bush, I thought, had some really interesting policies in Latin America that got buried. The substance of Biden's Build Back Better, we don't know because it's getting buried in process,
Mhm.
which does a disservice to whoever's in charge and trying to get stuff done, does a disservice to the debate, and actually might decrease confidence in democracy.
Interesting. So I don't think we can have a conversation about ethics and political rhetoric without talking about the January 6th attack. on the U.S. Capitol, right? So obviously, former President Trump's comments leading up to that attack were characterized as an incitement of insurrection in his impeachment trial. So is that fair? What do we
I
make of all that? What do we learn from that?
yeah, good question. So I'm on Sinclair um with some regularly, semi-regularly, almost regularly. I've been on Sinclair, and as you know, in journalism, Sinclair is not always beloved. It's a news outlet with a political agenda. Excuse me, I find their news site actually pretty good. Another Washington correspondent, and I gave an interview on television nationally in which I said President Trump should be impeached because he clearly incited an insurrection. Of course, it's an impeachable offense, and I thought that then, and I think that now. Uh, I, to the extent one of the faiths I hold most dear, the faith I hold most dear, is a faith in the American promise of an American ideal, a faith in an American civil religion, an idea that um, we haven't lived up to our promise. We haven't lived up to our ideals. The people who wrote that promise, who set out those ideals, failed them personally miserably. Right? Thomas Jefferson wrote a screed against slavery and tried to get slavery banned in the Constitution while he owned slaves and then traded it away. Right? We've had the Trail of Tears. We've built systems to make sure people who look and sound like me remain in power. Of course, that is bad. Of course, it's there, but we're getting better, and we can get better. And I believe in that promise of the ability to get better if we just honestly debate it out. Rough and tumble. It's not a straight line. It's messy. People make stuff up. But it is this ideal, and I believe in this deeply. Um, I've been in the Capitol. I mean, I was a chief of staff in the House, right? I spent a lot of time with the U.S. House of Representatives, and there's a painting on the inside of the Capitol dome called the Apotheosis of Washington, and it's literally Washington ascending to the heavens. And whenever I'm in the rotunda, which is it's over the rotunda, I look up and I catch my breath, and I should know better, right? I was in the rotunda after a State of the Union address and a media scrum, and very few things will crush your soul like a post State of the Union address media scrum. I was the chief of staff during Clinton's impeachment, right? I should be cynical. I'm not. My favorite view in the White House is there's a balcony called the Truman Balcony, which was put in by Truman, unsurprisingly, and it's these French doors that open up over a balcony, and it looks across to the Jefferson Memorial. And I don't know if it's by law or habit or whatever, but all the trees and shrubbery between the White House and the Jefferson Memorial are trimmed, and Jefferson's facing into the White House. And so you look out from that balcony and you see Thomas Jefferson, and he's looking back at you. It's actually my LinkedIn profile. I think that's the picture. And I always get the sense when I'm there that Jefferson is looking in, going, "Don't blow it. We work too hard. Don't don't blow this." And the insurrection threat to blow it. You had people storming my church because they believed a lie and they were incited by a bunch of people who believed a lie. They assaulted cops, law, Capitol police officers who protected my life every day. I got a death threat when I worked in the Senate. I relied on those people to protect my life. They protect the lives of tourists, people who are protesting, the kill the bill people who were really mad at my boss, then came in and wanted tickets to things. And where was the restroom and could they get a drink of water? The Capitol Police protected them. You had rioters, insurrectionists assaulting and killing, trying to kill them. You had people trying to undermine the sacred vote, right? Undermine the electoral process. That was offensive in the extreme. And I am fully with Representative Cheney. I'm nearly certain Representative Cheney and I disagree on a lot of really important issues. Guns, choice, who knows what else. But she stood firm and stood steadfast in her commitment to our democratic promise. That is what ethical political leadership looks like. Looks like Senator Romney, right? It looks like Jamie Raskin, Representative Raskin, who represents the suburbs of Maryland, whose son committed suicide shortly before the insurrection, and I think his daughter and friends were in the balcony when a bunch of knuckleheads dressed like cosplayers stormed in and ransacked the joint. One does not do that to the U.S. Capitol, and when one does, they should be roundly and soundly condemned. That did not happen. It is I mean, I know people who were there. Had this been a different year, I might have been there. Like that's not like yell at me, yell outside. Like the guys in the tri-cornered hats, kill the bill, fine, right? When I worked in the Senate, my boss was pro-choice, and my office was overlooked the Capitol on the Constitution Avenue side in the senator's office. We had a line of offices, and we all had little balconies, little French doors and stuff. And every year, a group of pro-life supporters would march to the Supreme Court, and they would stop under our window, and they would scream at us, and they would wave banners and signs. It wasn't terribly persuasive. It's not like one of us were going to walk out and go, "That's a great sign. We're changing our position on abortion." But no, we didn't complain about them. It's like, great, go march, go shout. I never once felt threatened by them, and that's the difference.
So anything you want to add before we turn it over to the Q&A? Is there anything we didn't get to?
No, thank you for letting me rant. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I really appreciate what you're doing. Um, there are centers for business ethics and all over the country. Every business program's got one. There are legal ethics or bioethics all over the country. And the idea that you're running a center focused on ethics in society, I think is really important. I think it's important that it's where it is, right? It's not everybody hanging out at Harvard telling each other how clever they are. It's the rest of America saying, how do we muddle our way through this? And I appreciate that the project that your center is run by a practicing journalist and academic. So it's not just somebody who thinks they know what to do because they did it once before, or on the other hand, somebody who knows what they do because they successfully managed to read, Machiavelli in the original. The fact that somebody like you is running it and leading these efforts and holding these conversations, I think is important. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Though I should clarify, I'm not a practicing journalist anymore.
But you were, but you
But
come out of the field. But you
I
come
do
out of,
come out of the
but you
field.
know what it's like to hit a deadline.
Yes, indeed. I am
And
still very motivated by deadlines. Yes.
but also the way you talk about letters to the editor, right? And the importance of local news, I think is really critical. And the demise of local news, I think is part of one of the challenges we have in this country. And I know you share that as somebody who was in local news
That's
and who
right.
tried to change that in local news and is now encouraging others to. If you haven't already, you should check out a book called News for the Rich, White, and Blue by Nikki
Mm.
Usher at Illinois.
Oh,
Uh,
sure.
she's fantastic. The
Hmm.
book is a really interesting, insightful look, data driven, but eminently readable, which is,
Nice.
as you know, not always the case.
Not always the case. And thanks also for the props on our focus. It's funny, I'm actually, right before I got on this call, I'm working on a draft of a chapter on a generalist approach to an ethics center because, ethics in society is pretty darn broad, but we're really committed to trying to think about things that are meaningful
I
to, right, to living well together. So
so I think actually
it's a
to that
broad
point,
remit, but
I
important.
I do see Taylor's question I want to get to, but what you raise is important. So when I was thinking about this project on ethics and political communication, I was raising in a faculty meeting. Somebody said, "Hey, Peter, you're doing this thing. Can you raise it?" And so I brought it. And originally it was going to be the project on political communication ethics. And one of my colleagues, who's politically conservative and a devout Catholic, said the problem with that is that implies you have political communication ethics and business ethics and
Mm.
journalism ethics, and you should have an ethical foundation that you apply situationally. You shouldn't have half a dozen different sets of ethics, right? And I got where I say she's a Catholic because
Mm.
that's how she lives her faith in the world, because it's her
Hmm.
faith, and then just brings it to the classroom or brings it to
Hmm.
church or brings it to her volunteer work. I thought, that's exactly right, which is why we're called the Project on Ethics in Political Communication,
Hmm.
not the Project on Political Communication Ethics. It's the ethics
Right.
leads. We're
We don't
applying it to
occupy separate moral universes, is how I like to put it.
a much more succinct way of putting this. Said by somebody who's written leads.
All right, so I think we're ready to turn to Q&A. So Anastasia, what do you have for us?
We have one that is asking you guys to talk more about ethics in a business setting.
Oh, well, we just brought that up. So not my specialty, but I guess kind of piggybacking off what we just said, I guess I would be of the view that there's not a separate moral universe, and so what's ethical for me is ethical for Peter, though certainly different contexts will draw out different kinds of issues, right? And there might be some moral commitments that you make in given settings as a professional, for example, or as a member of a corporate board that are going to commit you to certain things that perhaps Peter's not committed to, right? Or Anastasia's not committed to, which generates some particular obligations, right, for you and other people that are involved in the same kind of occupation or role. Your thoughts, Peter?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing an intersection of democratic values and business practices in a couple of different ways, not just in the US, but globally. So should companies don't, so after the January 6th insurrection, a number of companies said, we're not going to donate to anybody who voted to overturn the election, because we're not going to support people who undermine democracy. Some have gone back on that, others have not gone back on that. That's a business and an ethical decision. Companies constantly say they're pulling conferences from states based on state regulations or laws. The NCAA pulls games. The NFL wouldn't hold the Super Bowl in Arizona until they ratified Martin Luther King Day. These are business decisions with political and ethical dimensions, and I think it's a challenge for companies to decide what the right thing to do is, and then do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, rather than the trendy performative thing to do, or out of rank fear. And I think they are participants in our democratic society, excuse me, and companies have an obligation to act their values and to help maintain the democratic system we have, which allows all of us to enjoy the fruits of the labor of the entrepreneurs. And I try to be a good consumer. I'm not a perfect consumer. But if I buy books, I try to buy my local bookstore. We've got some great ones in DC. If I've got to order it, I order from bookshop.org, which gives proceeds to local bookstores. I do buy stuff from Amazon, but I try not to buy books from Amazon. Like, God bless Jeff Bezos. Like, what a brilliant, in fact, go Jeff. He lives in not my neighborhood, certainly, but, neighborhood adjacent, you know, but still, I also like small businesses, right? So I think these are business and ethical decisions with social implications as well.
And I guess I would add to that, I appreciate when businesses, and as you say, it can be difficult to know exactly, what to do in certain circumstances. But I sometimes get a little tired of hearing that, it's good ethics is also good business. I mean, I think that can be true, but it's not always true, and it takes some moral courage sometimes to potentially take a hit to your bottom line to do the right thing.
And it's an
So I
interesting reason
value
to
that.
be ethical. We see this about why be ethical in politics. Inevitably, political professionals in my 5 question series, or when they guest lecture in my class, will say, well, your reputation, you live and die by your reputation. So really, ultimately, it's good business. That may or may not be true. Like,
Exactly.
sometimes people who cheat win.
Right.
But be good. And the other part we're seeing globally is I've got to know a regional government in the Basque country in northern Spain. There's a province called Gipuzkoa, and they work on collaborative governance, where they bring public and private sector together, businesses, communities, civil society, and say, okay, look, here are the challenges we're facing here in San Sebastian or Donostia, depending on your politics. How do we address them? How do we make sure that people have good jobs? How do we make sure they have healthcare? And how do we make sure we're creating an environment in which entrepreneurs can come in and maybe, get really rich or really successful, or certainly just be happy? Like, how can we all do this together? And which becomes, so it's not business, civil society, voters. It's
Right.
how do we as a community come together and say, what do we want to look like as a community? And
Mm-hmm.
how do we move forward as a community, which is an ethical question, which is, okay, that
That's right.
means this for my business. That means this for my campaign. That means this for my family, right? But it's much more of almost Aristotelian view of the polis or the polity, and how one that behaves to maintain that polity. I have to name check Aristotle once. If I don't, it's just something I do.
Anastasia, are there other questions, or do we need to? Is there? I mean,
Yeah.
feel free if
No.
you need to unmute anybody if they need to ask for clarification.
Yeah, does anybody have a clarification for that? I will unmute you. No, alrighty. We have another question of how are we going to survive from past experiences that happened by a previous president? What will voters do when the next election comes around?
That's a really good and important question, and I don't know. At the beginning, I said the good news, the good little p political news, little d democratic news coming out of yesterday's elections was, so far nobody's shouting fraud, nobody's shouting rigged elections. Part of it is Republicans won a bunch, right? In Virginia, no one's gonna, the election was stolen, give it to the Democrats. This isn't, no one's gonna say that out loud. But even in New Jersey, where, you know, the Democrat was reelected by less than many people expected, but odds are good the Democrats elected. All the votes have yet to be counted. The Republican is doing what I would do in the Republican's shoes, which is, let's wait for all votes to be counted and just buy yourself 72 hours to kind of do the math, right? But the Republican is not saying, George Soros paid illegal aliens to come in. Like none of that garbage is out there, which I think is good news. I am very concerned that the establishment of partisan election boards in states is going to undermine faith in elections. And I really hope that whoever the Republican nominee is for president in 2024 does not repeat the lies of the 2020 election. All we have in democracy is our confidence in democracy, and democracy survives because we all talk about it in ways that make us agree it survives. And I think it's an open question what happens next. I hope. I have to be optimistic. I work in politics. I'm a Red Sox fan up until 2004. One had to rely on optimism. So I think it'll be okay. But I do think we're at a pretty dicey point.
I don't have anything to add. I don't. I'm waiting along with everybody else to find out that answer.
I think journalists can do a good job of pressing candidates on this. They can do a better job of saying.
They can do a better job.
They can do
Yeah,
a better job
I'm
saying.
still surprised at how many gotcha questions there are to get the soundbite. Again, just so much of it seems to me to be noise. And
But I wish that if there were follow-ups on, do you believe Biden was elected, won the election? Well, there are a lot of
right.
questions. Do you believe, in spite of everything else, like just nail them? And if they say no, make them defend their position. Like don't. It's easy. I've done these interviews. It's easy to let people kind of wander
It
around
is.
to get away with stuff. This is important. Nail them down on it.
Yeah, actually, I have to say, when I listen to the BBC, World News Service, sometimes I'm struck by how relatively aggressive they are with their own government officials. They have a very different attitude, I think, about political reporting than we do. And yet, of course, they're scrupulously, professional and objective, but they're much more hard nosed, I think, sometimes than reporters in the United States. I think we could learn something there.
I watch Ted Lasso and their press conferences.
I mean, right? It's very interesting to me, the contrast.
It's all going to come back to soccer at some point.
Yep, it always does. You name check Aristotle and
And soccer. I
We're
feel
on
like
the
we're
same
good.
team.
This has been a successful conversation.
So, Anastasia, other questions?
Yes. Another one is early in the talk, you mentioned 5 questions used in finding out how much concern various organizations have with political ethics. What were they?
Right. So it's called the 5-question series. I asked the same political practitioners the same 5 questions. Embarrassingly, I didn't remember them off the top of my head. I could pull up another computer and get them, or maybe Professor Borden can.
Let me
But
see. I might be able to pull
because
them up.
you just responded to them recently,
And
and I've asked, gosh, a whole range of people, and it's. And you should check it out, ethicsandpoliticalcommunication.org. The link is in the chat. You can
we
just
put the link in the chat.
click
Yeah.
through to the 5 questions. And there's a general consensus. Unsurprisingly, people who agree to answer the 5 questions believe we ought to have more ethics in political communication, and that one ought to behave ethically. Thanks for putting it in there again, Anastasia. If one ought to behave ethically because it's the right thing to do, and also because careers are short. Right. So a guy named Bill Doster, for example, who's now with Senator Sanders, he was with Senator Reid, sort of a longtime fixture in the Senate. He was in the Clinton administration. He retired from the Senate when Senator Reid left and finished his PhD in theology and was teaching at University of Maryland, and now is back with Senator Sanders. And he said something to the effect of, your career can end tomorrow. So make sure you're doing something today that's going to make you feel good about that. Your careers end quickly. Jim Kessler, who is the number 2 at a left of center think tank called Third Way, was a senior aide to Senator Schumer. Actually worked on Senator Schumer's first U.S. Senate campaign, and that's rough and tumble politics, right? I mean, Schumer. One of the jokes in D.C. is the most dangerous place to be in Washington is between Chuck Schumer and a microphone, and Kessler said, quoting Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the mouth. And the way if you're going to hit somebody, hit them in a way that if that hit were made at you, you would say, wow, that hurt, but that was fair. And after a really bruising Senate campaign against Aldamato that Schumer ended up winning, it was a brutal campaign, but both sides walked away Nobody walked away saying the other side cheated. It was bruising in a New York rumble kind of a way, but nobody cheated. So those tend to be the answers, um, and the idea that we have an obligation to a democratic promise to the conversation itself is a theme that runs through it. I think. Professor Borden, you've read
I
them.
did
What's your
find the
take?
questions. Yes. So here are the questions. Okay. So to what ethical standard should political communication be held? Where should political communication ethics be grounded? The second question, why should someone in political communication behave ethically? The third question, can you give an example of ethical political communication? What can people point to and say, do more of that? Number four, can you give an example of an ethical challenge or question you or political communication professionals in your field have faced or are likely to face? And the last question, what advice about ethics do you have for people studying political communication or starting their careers in the field?
So thank you. I should remember this, I think and when people talk about the good examples of ethical political communication, one that a lot of folks point to is Senator McCain. Um, correcting somebody in some town hall. Somebody stood up and was complaining about that foreign blah 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 Obama, and McCain cut her off and said, "Look, he's a good, honorable man. He's a patriot. I disagree with him." That is an example. When I worked on the Affordable Care Act, it was a pretty rough debate. Senator Coburn, who's a doctor, a conservative Republican doctor from Oklahoma, was in a town hall, and somebody stood up and started criticizing Speaker Pelosi in very personal terms, and Senator Coburn cut her off and said, you know, she's a patriot. I disagree with her. I think she's wrong on these issues. I think she's wrong on this, but you need to know I know her, and she's smart. She's a good person. I think Representative Cheney's vote after the insurrection. I think Senator Romney's remarks on the floor of the Senate after the insurrection. I think Vice President Gore's concession speech in 2000. These are all really good examples. I think President Obama's concession speech, clearly not the outcome he wanted, because he wanted obviously Secretary Clinton to get elected, but he said, you know, we're with you. And I have to say that wasn't just public rah stuff. A couple days after the election, right after the election, the day after the election, I think the president had a meeting with all of his cabinet secretaries to sort of unpack what had happened. A day later, all the secretaries got on the phone with all the political appointees, and I was a senior advisor to the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. And so I was on the phone with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is where the FDA lives. And she said, you know, this was not the outcome we wanted. We have a lot of people put a lot of heart and soul into this. We have a long weekend coming up. Take a long weekend, lick your wounds, nap, and then come back to work and serve the American people, because the president has made it very clear that we are here to serve the American people. And your last day at work is noon on January the 20th. And up until then, or if you leave before that, up until then, you serve the American people. So I think those I think are some examples of that. I think former Governor McAuliffe, Terry McAuliffe, last night. My wife and I joined Virginians in wishing the governor-elect the best of luck. We're here to help. There's graciousness at this. At this point, the bar is so low that I will take gracious.
Graciousness. Thank you. Other questions, Anastasia?
Yes. We have another one. It says we've run into that business/ethics clash in terms of pulling conferences from hotels that engage in certain hiring practices. So just
Yeah, but
commenting.
it is an interesting question. Is how political do you want to be, right? And are there places you will or won't stay? And what will and won't you do as a consumer? And there's a hotel here in DC that's owned by a labor union, and so Democrats stay there because they want to support a union hotel. Great. I'm a capitalist, right? And part of capitalism isn't everybody make as much money as you can. That's a misreading of Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith wrote about the responsibility of corporations. And corporations left unchecked are a bad thing, and that I kind of believe in stakeholder capitalism, right? So if you're part of an organization that says we're not going to have a conference in Texas because of their new abortion law, and you disagree with that organization, then maybe quit the organization or write a nasty letter or do whatever you want to, like, engage in the marketplace, right? And I'm not, I've got views on all sorts of things, and I try to exercise them politically by shopping at bookshop.org rather than Amazon, but sometimes I go to Amazon. Like I need a new soccer ball. And all the sporting goods stores in my neighborhood closed, partially because of pandemic, and partially because of Amazon. I'm gonna get it on Amazon. It'll probably be made in China with labor practices I dislike, and they'll be polluting. I'm not gonna not buy a soccer ball, but it's it's a weird mushiness, right? And what I encourage my students to do, what I encourage all of you to do, is just be aware you're in the mush, right? And make conscious decisions. This isn't, you know, wear a cloth sack and be pure, right? We're not Diogenes standing in the streets living in a barrel looking for the last good man. We're doing the best we can and be intentional about the decisions, what you say, who you support, where you put your dollars. I, right? I drive a sports car. Those are environmentally unfriendly, but it's cool. So, you make the, but I walk to work. So make the trade-offs.
Yeah, I have to say, when it comes to these consumer choices, I just find myself every day thinking, is there any way that I can just completely avoid evil today? And the answer is always no.
No,
Yeah, no.
I,
But it can be very frustrating if you're trying to be an intentional consumer.
but you can be sort of better, right?
Sure, of
I'm not
course.
asking America to be this utopian return to that mythical land where everyone sat down and debated as well. You have a very good point. What I hear you saying is like we're not like that'd be nice, but Habermas, I just think Habermas is wrong. I just think I'm sorry for any Habermas fans on the call. But like it's messy and it's ugly and I say when I play soccer, I don't click people's Achilles, but you get in a late hit or you like just try to make politics less awful. We don't have to make it perfect. We just got
That's
to make
awful
it
skin.
less awful, like make it better, which means that when you can, how you can, be better. Which means you have to have a sense of what better is and think about it and keep it in front of mind. Some advice I
That's
give
true.
my students and my students have taken and they've actually talked about is write down the 3 or 5 things. Write down what is your ethical foundation? What is it? Is it what would my grandma say? Is it the Gospel of Paul? Is it the Quran? Is it Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics? Is it Kant? Like write it, like take a long walk and think about it and write it down and put it on a post-it note on your computer. And then write down, I will and won't do these 3 things. If asked to do this at work, I will object. And if I'm overruled, I will go be a barista. Like write that down. The time to decide where your ethical line is not when you're at that line. It's not if you're working on a candidate campaign. It's not Thursday before election day in a hotly contested race. Like that's not when to decide whose money to take or how to attack the candidate. Do it, reflect on it, and then put it on a post-it note and put it on your wall. Pete Buttigieg did this with, he had his rules of the road. There were 10 things. They were all over his website. They were you could buy t-shirts. They were in his campaign offices and they were adopted by Biden when Biden was the nominee. Biden added no malarkey because he's Biden
Because it's Biden.
and there's like a train graphic involved because Biden, but it was a hey, look, these are our aspirations for how we're going to behave. Everybody knows them, they're everywhere, and they didn't follow them all the time, and it pissed people off and whatever. But at some point, you look up and go, you know what? This is it. I'm pointing sort of vaguely at you, but like this is what we will and won't do. Know it, write it down, put it in front of you. I have one student, we did a conversation a few weeks ago on email digital ethics. One student said when she took her new job, she wrote down her ethical foundation, like the 3 or 5 things. What do I think is right and wrong? Okay, not okay, inbounds and out of bounds. And she schedules time. She writes on her calendar time every few months to revisit the list. For 30 minutes, I'm going to go back.
Nice.
How am I doing? Do that. I think if we all did that, we'd be 10% better, 20% better. That
I
seems
like that.
good.
It's a nice idea.
I have really smart
Any more?
students.
You do. Sounds great. Well, I always tell my students, ethics classes are, it's preventive. We're doing preventive ethics, right? Because we have the time and the companions and the space, right? Again, to be able to think through things in a way that's not always possible in the moment because we have to make a decision now or we're really upset or whatever it might be, right? The time to think through those questions is earlier. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. Any other questions, Anastasia?
There's one question left. It says, can you comment on identity politics?
That's a tricky question, and I don't know. That's a tricky question. I'd be interested in the ethical. I can imagine the ethical dimensions of that. Um, I one of my rules of thumb. I'm not sure if this is getting at what you mean, Michael, but I try to call people what they call themselves and how they want to be seen. There's a line I can never find the source whenever I look for it, but I think it was Tennessee Williams in one of his writings. Take people as they would have themselves be, and if somebody's pronoun is them, great. Like what you call yourself is nothing. It doesn't take anything away from me. It's not like this extra letters bother me any. Like that's fine. If you want to have your identity, celebrate your identity. I get a little concerned, a lot concerned in a democratic polity when our identities can't be shared or to their at the exclusion of other identities. So Danielle Allen, who's a classicist and a rhetorical, she's a classicist and a political scholar at Harvard. She's also running for governor of Massachusetts. Her dissertation, I think, is on Plato, Platonic notions of justice. Like really smart woman. Has written a couple of books talking to strangers in which she argues, among other things, that America really became a democracy after Brown v. the Board of Ed. And that the worst advice we tell our children is don't talk to strangers because democracy relies on us talking to strangers. We only ever talk to our friends. We balkanize. She wrote another book called Our Declaration about the Declaration of Independence, and she writes that she was teaching at the University of Chicago, and she was volunteer teaching like English as a second language or something. I'm going to get back to the community. I'm going to do good. And there's a lot of first generation or a lot of people who just emigrated to the US, non-English speakers. And she had them read the Declaration of Independence because like you're learning how to be Americans and it's relatively straightforward. And she said she never really paid attention to the Declaration of Independence until that class, which is weird for a political scientist, right? But she read it like, okay, we're going to do the critique. And what does the critique of this amendment mean? And it's going to be on this. But she never really sat down and thought, what does this mean? Like if you just moved here from some war-torn country, you walked here from El Salvador to escape violence and gangs and poverty. These are really profound words, right? And she writes in another piece, in one of her more scholarly pieces, that we need to, instead of striving for unity in America, we need to strive for wholeness. We are not one united people, but we are a whole people, right? And we are whole if we embrace and celebrate each other's identities in ways that allow us to come together and allow that shared space. All of us have multiple identities. Right, I'm a soccer fan, obviously DC United season ticket holder from day one. It's been more painful than not some years rather than others. I'm a New Englander. I'm an Emerson College alum. I'm an SMPA professor. I'm a middle-aged white guy. I'm a Washington DC resident. My mom was a Brit, so at some level I'm probably English, like we're all of these, and I take pride in some of them, and I celebrate many of them in ways that many people find irritating when I endlessly talk about soccer or the Basques. But I do it in a way that hopefully isn't to the exclusion of or denigrates anything else. Right? My friends from Ghana aren't less because Ghana is not as cool as the Basque country. Like that just doesn't make any sense. It's a notion of the whole, and I think my concern with identity politics is if somehow you think my identity isn't valuable or you want to erase it. That's kind of my gut on it. I'm still learning about it. The last thing I would suggest on this is a book it's an idea I've read a lot about. I haven't read the book yet, but it's a friend here in DC named Barrett Pittner, Black American, born and raised in Georgia, but his family has the bills of sale from his relatives when they were sold. And Barrett has started his life as a journalist, and he's since now becoming a public intellectual. And he started something called the Sustainable Culture Lab here in DC, where he talks about the idea of sustaining a culture. And he has a new book called Ethnocide, in which he argues that the word ethnocide was invented by the same guy who did the word genocide. And alongside the word genocide took off. Ethnocide sort of languished as a word. And he wants to bring it back. And his argument is in ethnocide, genocide, we kill people. Jews, Armenians, whatever. With ethnocide, we keep the people, but we kill the culture. And his argument is that's what we did to Black Americans because we needed the bodies on the plantations. But we had to strip them of their culture so they wouldn't have identity, so they were only machines. And what we need is to shift and get to a point of creating culture, creating a sustaining society. And it's not at the expense of another. It's not my identity will wipe out your identity. It is my identity is valuable and good and interesting. What can I learn from your identity? Together, how can we create maybe a new identity? Make it a positive growing thing? And so I think that's part of a positive way to look at it. But as I said, Barrett and I talk about this a fair amount, in part because he and I are both Arsenal fans. So when we're not complaining about Arsenal, we're talking about how we construct an America that is whole and positive, that's honest about our past, but isn't beholden to it. That somehow can figure out a way to get better together, which I believe, right? The Richard Rorty, who's an American pragmatist philosopher, died, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, wrote in a book called Achieving Our Country, which is over there somewhere, that we have to be loyal to a dream country, not the one we wake up in every morning. We can't be defined by our past. Our national character is still in the making. We have to be honest about our past. We have to own up to our past. Then we have to figure out what do we do about it to be better. And we have to wake up every morning working towards the dream country. And I think to the extent we can use identity and our shared identity to do that, terrific. I think if identity just leads to balkanization or disillusion, I'm not sure that's a good thing. I think.
So I see that we're at 7 o'clock, and I have a feeling this conversation could go on much longer, but I want to be respectful of people's time. So thank you, Peter, for coming to talk with us today. And thanks to all of you for attending today's program and for your great questions. I hope to see you at a future Ethics Center event. And again, we will be sending the link out for the recording to everybody who registered and putting it on our website. So again, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thanks to all of you.
Thank you very much for hosting. I'm happy to talk to anybody, follow up, send me an email. I'm eminently Googleable. And I look forward to tuning in and listening to your conversations in the spring semester. Best of luck to everybody on the rest of this fall. Get vaccinated, and we'll see you all in the spring.
Thanks.